Hello, everybody, and welcome to JTV. Recently, a few people put in my direction some clips of a guy called Dan Bilzerian. And I hadn't really been familiar with this guy, but he's very, very popular online. He is a businessman, but also seems like a prolific gambler. He's definitely a kind of bit of a social media star and womanizer and seemingly a bit of a playboy. And also, I've been going through his Wikipedia page, it's a bit of a complicated life story, and there's definitely all kinds of legal suits involved in his life and issues of violence and all these kind of things. But not necessarily someone I would expect that people would go to for geopolitical views and morality lectures, but it seems he's decided to wade in on that, particularly around what's happening with Israel and the war against Hamas. But also he's gone totally all the way to talk about the Jews as well. But we're joined by Rabbi Daniel Rowe, who I felt would be the perfect person to discuss what Dan's been saying. Because, as I said, he's not just talking about Israel anymore. He's now wading into Jewish issues, particularly, as you'll see here, talking about, look what the Talmud says and all these horrific things that it says, and that's why the Jews are terrible and blah, blah, blah. And we can talk about all that. But I also saw an interview that he did recently where he made all kinds of accusations against Israel. Just to be clear, this is someone who believes that Israel was responsible for JFK's assassination, for 9/11. He just for some reason seems absolutely dead set on this. He's in the same kind of league as people like Candace Owens and Andrew Tate, where they've gone full-hearted against Israel. And so I want to unpack some of this with Rabbi Rowe. Rabbi, I think we should start, before we start off, by looking at some of these quotes that he's posted, supposedly from the Talmud. Before we unpack them, I wondered if you just had any general comments on my introduction and just a sense of who this guy is and what's happening before we go into the specifics, because there's a lot here.
Yeah. Like, I don't know people personally. I prefer not to speak about them if I don't know them personally. I prefer often not to speak about people if I do know them personally. But by the way, the post you showed just before, where he's going straight out for the Talmud, that is sounds very much like it's anti-Jewish. And as you added in, supposedly Jews are involved in 9/11. You should know, until relatively recently, I was quite shielded from a lot of these crazy accusations. They were like these things that belong to the lunatic fringe. Since the war began, I've had a lot of people reach out, some who are actual anti-Semites using this to prove how evil Jews are, some who are just genuinely concerned people or confused about, is this stuff true? So 9/11 is a great example. There's always this quote, well, 3,000 Jews survived that day and didn't turn up at work. You know, so it's so crazy. You know, there's a building that had 50,000 people in them. Only 3,000 died that day. I mean, that's terrible and tragic, but 47,000 were saved. Right? The Jews were roughly just over 10% of the population of the buildings in a normal day of work. That particular morning, 3,000 Jews did not go to work, or were not in the offices in the morning when the plane struck. That particular morning, 25,000 non-Jews were also not there.
Yeah.
So, like, this conspiracy, the Jews knew about it. Well, how did the non-Jews all know about it? I mean, thank God 25,000 of them weren't there, right?
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
The truth is, it was the first day back at school, and lots of people just came into work late, having taken their kids to school. That's the main reason. And yes, about 10% of the people who didn't turn up were Jewish. About 10% of the people who did die that day were Jewish, right? So, you know, these ludicrous conspiracy theories,
Yeah, it's so lazy. And it's clearly caused by some kind of deeper issue. It can't be the facts, and so we'll touch on that perhaps later. But let's go into some of the specific accusations that he's leveled, because he's posted this on Twitter to his over 1 million followers. It's had 3.4 million views, 28,000 likes. So he wrote, the Talmud is, after the Hebrew Bible, the central text of rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish religious law and Jewish theology. Until the advent of modernity in nearly all Jewish communities, the Talmud was the centerpiece of Jewish cultural life and was foundational to all Jewish thought and aspirations, serving also as the guide for the daily life of Jews. Now, here are the quotes that he's posted. I don't know if you'd like me to go through them one by one, or whether I should just go through them entirely, and then you can give us a overall viewing. Let's maybe start one by one. So the first one is, let's go for the top left one. It says, even the best of Goyim, meaning non-Jews, should all be killed. I mean, this is alien to me, this stuff, but
yeah, it is. Okay, so let's make a few general comments. First of all, he's right about the quote about how central the Talmud is to Jewish life. That's absolutely true. Second of all, he's not the first to come up with these quotes. Well, the second point I want to make before I get to where these quotes come from, and then we'll go through them in detail, is that Talmud, as you'll probably know this, is an incredibly difficult work to study. It's not one work. It's usually 36 volumes, how it's usually printed, 35, 36, 37 volumes, very thick pieces of work. If you go through 2 pages a day, it takes 7 years to do it, and it's very hard to go through 2 pages a day like most. A lot of Jews kind of sit in the back of a lecture every day for an hour on those 2 pages. But if you've ever studied Talmud, you'll know that it's very, very dense, complex material. And verses and lines, they were literally recording debates between rabbis that could take place over many days, when lines will be thrown in multiple directions, and ever just exerting one line will usually, even if it's accurate, will often be very, very misrepresentative. Now, the third point I wanted to make is, where did most of this list come from? The origin of most of this list, because this is not, he hasn't probably gone and done research himself. I doubt it. There's not a lot of Jews who finish the whole Talmud cover to cover in their lifetime and really know what's going on in it. So what he's done is these things just circulate all over the internet, right? And they circulate especially in anti-Israel or anti-Jewish or anti-both, which is increasingly the same overlap group. Their origin is probably, there's been different iterations of anti-Talmudic pieces of work over history. A very, very big one was a 17th century piece of work by a guy called Jon Andreas Eisenmenger, and he wrote a work called Jury Unmasked. Okay, this in the 1600s, 17th century, and most of the quotes here come from there. Now, by the way, they're almost all not quotes. There's usually a longer list full of fabrications. This is not 100% fabric. I'll explain what each of these are. There's one or two I think are completely made up in here, but most of them are attempts to summarize the Talmudic discussion. They're not quotes, they're attempts to summarize the Talmudic discussion. You should know that in 1876, the German Imperial Academy of Sciences wrote a whole report. They did an in-depth study into his claims, right? And the conclusion was, and this is the quote, it's a collection of scandals. Some passages are misinterpreted, some are distorted, and others are insinuations based on one-sided inferences. Okay, so this is not very reliable. Now, you can go through one by one, as you say. The first quote, even the best of the Goyim, meaning nations of the world, and non-Jews should all be killed. Now, that would sound horrific. I'd say, what, we should all have a genocide and wipe out all the non-Jews of the world. So the source Sophorim is actually a late, slightly post-Talmudic source. But the actual source itself is a pre-Talmudic source, and it's a medrash, a halachic medrash. So just to explain to readers what's going on over here, Talmud is put together of several centuries, right? The very earliest Talmudic works are around the turn of the millennium. Some of the source material goes back a century or so before then, and eventually the Talmud is written down, centuries later. Just let's say around, usually it's assumed that the general redaction of the Talmud, although there was redaction taking place later than that, is around the 5th century. So, but prior to that, it's a lot of source material. Okay, prior to that, it's a lot of source material. So this is a relatively early source called a Mechilta, which is a halachic medrash. And the Mechilta on Exodus asks the following question. It says, the Egyptians pursue the Israelites at the sea. Sorry, bit of a cough. They pursue the Israelites at the sea, and they've got chariots and horses. And the Midrashic ancient rabbinic text asks the question, where did they get horses from? There were all these plagues against Egypt, many of which killed animals. And the conclusion of the Midrash is, well, actually, there's a biblical verse that explains how it's possible animals survived the worst of the plagues. Exodus 9:20 says that Hayores Devar Hashem, those who feared God, would keep the animals inside, like Moses warned. Don't leave the animals outside while there's going to be a hailstone bombardment, etc. So the Talmud says, 1 second, but if they're the holy people who care about Hashem and God, what are they doing chasing the Jews, the Israelites at the sea? And on that, Rabbi Shimon comments in that context that even the best of them need to get killed. The best of those nations need to be killed, right? In other words, if they're crossing, they're coming to get you at the sea, even the ones that fear God seem to be wanting, in that particular context, to kill you, and they also had to then be drowned in the sea. And it's not clear whether there's meant to be any legal implication other than that at all. Some want to derive from it that if there's a war where they're coming to kill you, like the Egyptians were, even if you know that some of them are otherwise pious individuals, don't spare them in the war. That's the most that's ever taken from there. But it absolutely, in any scenario where they're not coming to kill you, there's no permission by anybody to say that they should be killed. So that's a classical example of take a line completely out of its context, and you end up with something that's nothing to do with what was originally said, and you end up with something really grotesque going on. That's just one example. You could do something very similar.
Wow.
If you're happy to go through them all one by one, if you want.
Yeah, I think we should go through at least a flavor of them, because it's so bizarre. Like it's like this is so not the Torah that I have learned. You know, when I think about some of the, you know, yes, on the one hand, Judaism is very particularist about saying, you know, charity starts with your family, with your nation, all that. And goodness me, if the Jewish people weren't looking after themselves with all the adversaries they've had throughout history, we wouldn't be here. But so we also can't forget the massive universalist element to Judaism that I would some ways say is much stronger in reality than what you might get in other religions, who are say, you know, you have to follow our path in order to have salvation, have God. If I think about the story of Jonah and God's concern for the people of Nineveh who were doing terrible things and teaching him the importance of that. If I think about the fact that he wanted the Egyptians and Pharaoh to repent, he didn't just want the Jews to leave, he wanted them all to come and recognize the truth. There's such the fact that we named the Torah reading where the Jewish people received the Ten Commandments after a non-Jew who changed his ways. The fact that the Messiah comes from a convert, like it's so. There's such. It's the way they're trying to characterize Judaism is just so alien to the Judaism that I know.
You're absolutely right. And Judaism I know, and the Judaism anyone who follows the Talmud knows. By the way, I should say. It's not. I have actually heard the occasional Jewish racist, who quotes religious sources and has to be condemned in the strongest possible way. But anyone like you or me who lives by the Talmud and follows the Talmud would know the love we're meant to have for everyone who's Jewish or not Jewish in the world, for every human being. Right? We all know the source in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, which is where we're meant to learn our ethical attitude on the world. That Hillel would teach. Be like the disciples of Aaron. Ohev shalom v'rodev shalom, right? Love peace and pursue peace. Ohev esabrios, love all the creations of the world, right? Jew, non-Jew, and makarvan the Torah, and bring them close to the Torah, right? Not convert them, but they should be keeping this Noahide laws and so on, like actually many religions in the world today probably do. So we're meant to have a love for everybody in the world. So yeah, you look at these sources like, oh my goodness, this is what it actually says. And as you're alluding to before, I mean, it's explicit that we don't convert people to Judaism, at least we don't encourage and push conversion and proselytize, partly because we believe that as a non-Jew, a person could go to the world to come. And that's also a Talmudic source, right? The Jerusalem Talmud in Peah 1:1 is very explicit that the righteous among the nations get to the portion of the world to come, codified by Maimonides in his attempt to codify Talmudic law, right, in the laws of Teshuvah 3:4, that the righteous Gentiles have a place in the world to come. This is something we believe. Good Jews and good non-Jews have a place in the world to come. They're beloved by God. And maybe we'll go through some other sources as well as we go through.
When you go through some more of these.
Contradiction, right, yeah. So let's take an example. The next one, all children of Goyim are animals. Again, that's not a quote from the Talmud. It's an attempt to sum up the Talmudic discussion there, and it completely misunderstands what's going on. Or the next one, Goy are not humans, they're beasts. I mean, I can go through any of these and explain to you the background. Let's take that third one on the page, for example. If I've got time, I'll go back over the second one as well. The third one is the Goys are not humans, they are beasts. That is absolutely not true. I'll tell you where it's coming from, though, because they're not all total fabrications. By the way, the one after that I think is a total fabrication. Gad Shas 2:2. A Jew may violate but not marry a non-Jew girl. I have never heard a source called Gad Shas. My suspicion is it's either a made-up source or it's, I don't know what it is. I mean, I don't know what on earth is going on over there. Maybe someone can enlighten us. What on earth is that meant to be? I think it's a complete fabrication. Now let's go to the one above it. Say, Bava Metzia, Gentiles, Goys are not humans, they are beasts. What's going on over there? Where's this person coming up with that misquote? But where could they misread the Talmud to be saying that? The discussion in 114b of Bava Metzia is the questions of purity and impurity of a corpse, right? If you walk over a Jewish cemetery, you become impure for certain Jewish laws, right? And the question is, does that apply to a non-Jewish cemetery as well, a non-Jewish corpse? Why shouldn't it? Well, because laws of purity and impurity have nothing to do with the Noahide law. They're not laws that generally non-Jews are bound by, and therefore they may not be laws that apply if a Jew is there as well. And the Talmud wants to work it out, and it quotes a verse, right? And the verse in Ezekiel, and it says, it's Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 31, and the verse says that you, Israel, you're my sheep, you're the sheep of my pasture, you are Adam. You are Adam, right? And Rabbi Shimon says, you are Adam, but the nations of the world aren't Adam. And you could translate Adam as human, right? And then, you see the Talmud saying you're humans and the nations of the world are not humans, right? So if you took it like that, it'd be like, oh my goodness, you're saying they're not humans. And then the conclusion here they want to draw is therefore they must be beasts, right? That's the conclusion they want to draw. It's not true at all. And I'll explain to you a bit about it. First of all, there are 4 biblical words for human, okay? There is Ish, Enosh, Gever, right? There's all, and Adam. 3 of them always appear in every biblical and Talmudic context as referring to all humans, Jew and non-Jew, right? So it's very, very clear that both Talmud and biblical law see Jews and non-Jews as human beings, full stop, not as animals, right? And you see that, the source I quoted before, righteous among Gentiles have a portion of the world to come. Animals don't, right? Again, it's embarrassing that I even need to say this. This is so pathetic. But what do you mean, Adam? So Adam is a different word because Adam refers always back to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And there, and I've explained this on previous videos, the idea was all of humanity was in some kind of single soul called Adam. And the end of history is going to be a return to that state when the whole of mankind is back as one, called Adam. And on the way, the Jewish people, Israel, was given a role to play. God took us out of Egypt and said, you're going to become a microcosm of Adam first. You're going to help bring about the Messianic era so that eventually the whole of humanity can become part of this Adam too. That's what he says. And that means sometimes when we use the word Adam, we mean the whole of humanity. I'll give you an example. And sometimes we mean just the Jewish people in the present era, right? So an example where it means the whole of humanity is the Talmud in Avodah Zarah, page 3, says that a non-Jew who studies the Torah that's relevant to them is considered as great as the high priest in Jerusalem, right? And the proof it brings is the verse that refers to the person who keeps the Torah and lives through them. It doesn't say a Jew, it says Adam. And Adam who keeps it, lives by them, gets eternity for them or whatever. So the verse in Leviticus there. So there you see explicitly the Talmud saying Adam means all of humanity. So when does it mean all of humanity? When does it just refer to Jewish people? It depends really on whether the law is relevant to all of humanity or whether the law is relevant to the Jewish people. Since the laws of purity and impurity are not a law that's meant to apply to Jews and non-Jews, it's not something the Noahide law binds non-Jews to, so it only applies to Jews. And since it only applies to Jews, you only become impure walking in a Jewish cemetery.
And where is this written? Where in the which Talmud are you referring to where it says this?
114b, Bava Metzia 114b. You can look it up yourself.
Right. So it's all there,
look
right?
The whole discussion there, you'll see.
Fascinating. I mean, it's so bizarre. Like, you know, I often think about when we sing Hallel, the prayer of thanksgiving, on
Hallelujah,
important occasions throughout the year,
yeah.
where we say at the end of history, all the nations will come to recognize God. Like,
Yeah,
we're not.
Psalms, yeah.
It's
You're
just
referring to
bizarre
Psalms
that people
107.
can try.
Absolutely, and the Talmud's full of all this. 100%. There's no. This is so. That's why a classical example. Now let's get to the source above there. Okay, again, now the source above there is probably the most complicated of all the sources on this page.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on over there in Yebamoth 98a, right? Yebamoth 98a is we're discussing what happens to converts, right? What is the legal status of a convert vis-a-vis previous relations, for example? And there's a sense in which a convert is to some degree like a newborn person, right? And therefore the question is, are they still related to previous relations? And the Talmud there is discussing, imagine two twin brothers convert. The reason it uses two identical twins is there's no doubt that they've got the same father and same mother, right? If they convert to Judaism, so and one of them dies childless, okay? So in Jewish law, in the biblical law, there's a principle: if a man dies childless, that if the brother and wife both want to, then they can marry, and the brother steps into the shoes, becomes like a surrogate parent. If he steps into the shoes of his brother and has the child, it's called levirate marriage. And if they don't want to, they have to undergo a ceremony called chalitza to formally separate. And the Talmud concludes that they don't need to do it, those twin brothers, if they both converted, because their relationship, their biological relationship, precedes the conversion. It's like they're newly born, and so it's not considered for that particular law like their brothers. The Talmud says, but what are you going to do with the biology? Right? At the end of the day, they're still clearly from the same seed, and the Talmud says that we can mafkir it, that the Torah itself can come along and say, okay, fine, we for legal purposes we ignore the biology. That's what it says, and it brings a verse, and the verse in Ezekiel, and it says that their seed is the seed of a horse. And so again, if you're reading that Talmud, what does that mean? Non-Jewish seed is like the seed of a horse, right? They're like animals, and that's what the anti-Semitic reading is doing, right? There's you see, the Talmud is saying it's because they're animals. That's not what the Talmud is saying. I'll prove it to you. Because in all laws where it's relevant, right, we always treat non-Jewish relations exactly the same as we treat Jewish relations, right? We treat the seed isn't the seed of an animal. It's ridiculous. So, for example, we say there's inheritance. Non-Jews inherit. The Talmud says explicitly that non-Jews inherit from their parents. They clearly, their seed is human seed. Or even more than that, we say that if somebody, a non-Jew, has children, they have two children, and then they convert to Judaism, do they have to remarry and have more children to fulfill the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply? Answer the Talmud, no, they don't. Because they gave birth to human beings. They fulfilled the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply as a non-Jew. So you see that it's a legal technicality that as they become a Jew. So what's with that verse? It's the verse from the book of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, what's happening over there is it's a metaphor. It's Ezekiel chapter 34. In Ezekiel chapter 34, Ezekiel is telling off Jewish people. He's telling off the nation of Israel. He's rebuking them. And he's talking about how they've been unfaithful to God. And he compares the Israel who's split into two kingdoms to be like two sisters, right? Allah and Ollie. It's a metaphor. And instead of being faithfully married to their husband, which means to God, obviously two sisters can't. It's a metaphor. Ezekiel's using a metaphor. He's saying they become like this unfaithful woman who, instead of being married to her husband faithfully, is prostituting herself to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. And it compares the Israelites who, instead of serving God, Hashem, are busy running after every idolatry in the world and assimilating into all the idolatrous religions around them. And that's what it does. And in the metaphor, it says that's like a person who leaves the loving relationship of their spouse and runs off and is becoming a prostitute and is having a relationship with people who treat them like an animal, and it's like the sex of donkeys. That's all. So what Ezekiel's saying is he's talking about a Jew who leaves the relationship with God and runs into all the local idolatries is considered like the equivalent in the metaphor and the analogy to somebody who's having that. So then it says the implication is what happens in reverse if one of the local pagans comes into Judaism. It's like they've entered a completely new relationship and completely new status. So all the old statuses don't apply. That's all it, and then to distort that and say what he's really saying is that all non-Jews are animals. Look, it's sort of a mistake you could make if you're just glancing quickly at the Talmud there, to be slightly fair to him. But I don't believe for 1 minute the originator of this, who is almost for sure Eisenmenger back in the 17th century, was doing that innocently. I think they knew exactly what they're doing. I think they knew the Talmud doesn't mean what they're saying. And I think they knew Ezekiel doesn't mean what they're reading him. They knew Ezekiel's using it as a metaphor. They knew the Talmud's dealing with a legal principle. And they knew that that's what using the analogical verse for. It's nothing to do. On the contrary, and somebody had researched the whole Talmud, so they knew full well that exactly as I said before, if a non-Jew converts to Judaism and they've already had children, they have fulfilled the biblical mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply because they've given birth to human beings, Jewish or non-Jewish. You've fulfilled the obligation. They're in the image of God. Right. So again, that's probably the most complicated out of all of them. I mean, all the others are just, I think, pretty much all baloney or total misrepresentations. I'm going to go through. Do you want me to keep going?
Please. Yeah, please.
Okay, so we said the fourth one down, I believe, is a fabrication. The fifth one down, again, it's just so ridiculous. It says a Gentile goy girls are in a state of niddah, filth. Niddah does not mean filth. Niddah is the legal status of a Jewish woman in menstrual bleeding, where you're not allowed to have sexual relations. And the Talmud in Avodah Zarah is discussing intermarriage. Intermarriage is not allowed in Jewish law, right? The marriage has to be between a Jewish couple to raise a Jewish home. And the question is that a biblical prohibition, or did the rabbis legally give the same status like we have in Jewish law for a woman who's in a state of menstrual bleeding to all non-Jewish women? That's the question there. It's not saying they've become filthy. That's ridiculous. If they were really treated as a state of menstrual bleeding, then a non-Jew couldn't have the relationship. But it doesn't apply. There's no prohibition of niddah. It's not, and the word niddah does not mean filth. God forbid. What, Jewish women become filthy? It's ridiculous. So that's all it's doing. It's just a discussion about what's the source of the prohibition. Was it a decree to treat them in the same legal status as a Jewish woman in a time when it's prohibited to have sexual relations, or is it a biblical prohibition? That's all. Next one, a Jew may have sex with a child as long as the child is less than 9 years old. That is baloney.
And just to say, he posted that particular one as well.
Go and look, and by the way, I encourage people, go and look up these sources yourself. I would warn you, try and go back to the beginning of the Talmudic discussion. And ideally, if you're not trained in reading Talmud before, you'll probably find most of these very confusing. The Talmudic discussion does require lots of training. But let's take a look at this source over here. What's going on is that, first I explained to you, therefore, just as one who engages in intercourse, and by the way, the non-bold text is not the Talmud, it's a commentary. Yeah. The bold text is the Talmud. Just as one who engages in intercourse actively is not liable if he's less than 9 years old. Let me explain what this is, okay? There's two prohibitions involved whenever you engage in intercourse, okay? If there's no consent from the other person, you're liable for damages, just like you're liable for damages if you ever use, hurt, or manipulate a body of any other human being, Jew, non-Jew, child, adult, as every decent legal system has sanctions for. There's a separate question. There are lots of laws in the Torah that are to do with sexual activity and sexual transgressions. For example, adultery, right? Homosexuality is forbidden. And some of these come with punishments. For an act to get those punishments, it has to be called a sex act, right? It can't just be physical use of somebody else's body. There has to actually be a sex act, and there's technical definitions of it, right? There has to be penetration, exchange of seed, and so on, in order to violate the biblical command. And what the Talmud says is if a boy is 9 years old and penetrates a woman, it's not considered an adulterous act because it's not considered a sex act, right? Whoever initiated it and harmed the other person is still liable for harm. It's just saying the technical laws and punishments to do with the sexual act don't apply if the child is under 9 years old. It's not that the woman hasn't performed adultery. They've just done abuse of a child. They've just, harmed that person as if they physically harmed them or emotionally harmed them in any other way. That's all that's going on over here. Is the liability, the special extra liabilities for a act of physical intercourse, a procreative act, what age does that start? And there's other technical criteria as well in order to violate the actual, let's say, adulterous act or homosexual act or whatever else it might be over there.
But isn't it at the end it's saying that the adult that engages with the child is not liable? That's what it looks like it's
They're
saying.
not liable for what? For the sexual crime, the punishment that comes with the sexual aspect of the crime.
So
And of
what would
course,
they
we're
be
not.
liable for in Torah?
What's that?
So what would they be liable for in Torah? What's
If they've in any way harmed physically or emotionally that child, there's regular penalties. There's a penalty for tsar, any pain caused. There's a penalty for boshas, any psychological damage caused. There's a penalty for nezek, any damages caused. There's a penalty for any medical costs that are involved. There's penalties.
So to be clear, it is prohibited.
Absolutely forbidden. That's
Yes,
not a
I
crime.
know, but let's just be clear.
Again, a person who doesn't know Talmud, and often the Talmud isolates one issue when there's many issues going on here, right? So there's two issues here. One, have you harmed the child? Of course you harmed the child. That's a whole separate discussion, nothing to do with this, right? The second issue, which Talmud's focusing on right over here, is have they both been involved? And in this case, a child would never be liable anyway. But is the adult also involved for whatever sex crime they might have been separate for a forbidden sexual relationship? And that, the Talmud says, no, there's not the forbidden sexual relationship. The damage to the child is a whole separate discussion. That's elsewhere. Right. That's something you have to. Right. That's something that fits into all the regular laws of damages. So again, this is, it's ridiculous. Again, it's not ridiculous. What they've done is they've taken a thing, they've slightly put it out of context, and they made it sound like it's saying something completely different to what it says. Right? A Jew may have sex with a child. That's ridiculous. Did not, by the way, even there, it didn't say they may have sex. It said they're not punished for the sexual law, the sexual punishment, which often is a death penalty, by the way. Right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things they like. Go on, please.
Many other technical grounds on which a person would not be punished for sex. In fact, the Talmud says that you almost never give a death penalty because there's so many technical exemptions. That's not the same as harm. They're two completely different issues.
Right. Because there is a lot of people in Dan's circles will make claims of Jews somehow sanction pedophilia. They often cite verse in the Talmud which talk about people getting married or having relations at very young ages.
Well, by the way, it is true that in most of history, I believe people married in their early teenage years. They became farmers, they worked and support families. It was not unusual for 14 or 15-year-old boy and girl to get married. People's lifespans were not as long. Everything was shorter. Right? The idea that you can just go and take a child and have sex with them is actually that's totally wrong. And there's plenty of places where Jewish law cites that it's wrong and it's not allowed. That's not a particular but that's exactly the point. So what it's doing is is there a special punishment for the extra crime of having transmitted seed into the body? And the answer is if the boy under 9 years old penetrates a man or woman, then it's not considered like he sent seed in. That's really all it is for that law.
Right.
And you want to use that child for that purpose, absolutely forbidden. It's absolutely, it's a regular act of terrible damages and so on.
Do you want to quickly go through the second column? Yeah.
The goy hits a Jew, he must be killed. Now, again, by the way, if you look at the Talmud, you'll see the word used is chayav misa, right? Is obligated death. As Maimonides points out, that never means you go and kill them. I'll give you an example. It says that if a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, walks down the road and there's a stain on his shirt, he's also must be killed. Right? It doesn't mean you physically go and kill them. I explain what it does mean. I'll tell you another example. Right? This says in Pirkei Avot that a person who forgets any of their Talmud is obligated to his life, which means he must be killed. It means in heaven there's a punishment, a potentially loss of the world to come. Very right. What it's saying over here that a non-Jew who uses anti-Semitic violence could lose. God will punish them with the potential of being killed in the world to come. That's what it means. When does it mean a physical death penalty? When it says neherag, right? That's referring to if there was a Sanhedrin or a rabbinic court, they could try them. It never says that about a non-Jew hitting a Jew unless they're about to kill them, in which case the same law applies to a Jew. If a Jew or non-Jew is about to kill someone, you can kill them to save the other one's life. But no, the Talmud absolutely does not say that if a non-Jew hits a Jew, he must be killed. That's absolutely ridiculous. By the way, it does bring a source point, which is that Moses kills the Egyptian, right? But the Talmudic commentary will ask on that, but there the whole point is that he had some kind of prophetic insight. You can't draw the analogy. So this is exactly the same as all over the Talmud where it says, a Torah scholar walks out with a stain on their jacket. It doesn't mean you take them to court and kill them. It means that if they are creating a desecration of God's name, because people look at them and say, oh gosh, people who serve God are filthy, and that leads to people rejecting God, then that person has to defend themselves on did that violate the whole purpose of life, right? If a Jew wantonly just forgets Torah, now of course we all forget, we're humans, right? But in other words, it means they don't care enough to try at least to memorize. Then there's another potential issue. And again, you understand this is a rabbinic way of talking, and at worst it means that you have what to answer for, a very serious thing to answer for in the world to come. And absolutely, people who are violent in the name of anti-Semitism, people who gather Jews on the street and beat them up, are going to have to answer a very serious question and possibly lose their world to come for it. That's what it's saying. Right? Yeah. So again, now again, an innocent person just sees this as a one-off line of it. Oh my God, but anyone looks inside the Talmud, and anyone looks inside that Talmud, to be fair, and doesn't know that rule and hasn't seen the other bits of Talmud that use the parallel phrase might get confused by that. That could have been an innocent mistake. Right?
Yeah.
Same thing, the next one, when a Jew murders a Gentile, there'll be no death penalty. Let's go again. What's going on over there? We're talking about biblical law here, by the way. This is talking about in the land of Israel, where anyone who enters the land of Israel and becomes a citizen of the land of Israel and agrees to keep its law is fully protected by the law. Is a Jew allowed to murder a non-Jew? Absolutely not. It's completely forbidden. Again, numerous sources. If you want them, I can happy. If anyone wants in the comments, I'm happy to share loads and loads and loads of sources.
It's one of the Ten Commandments.
Right, there you go. You cannot kill, doesn't say any Jew, 100%. Yeah, 1,000% right. Now, here what it's saying is, what refers to as a non-Jew in this category is somebody who enters the land of Israel and refuses to keep any of the law. Right, they're literally, the Talmudic word is they're an idol worshipper. So that's like somebody who comes into a country to rebel against its law. Can they then appeal to the courts to get the courts to punish others who have violated them? And then the courts will not intervene and punish. If they've rejected the court's authority and law, then they cannot use the court to punish others. That's all it's saying. Nothing, God forbid, to say that it's okay to kill. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Even the way it quoted there, by the way, it didn't even say that there will be no death penalty. By the way, the minute you leave the land of Israel, or you're in a time where there's no Sanhedrin and no Torah law, obviously it doesn't apply, because they're not rejecting the law in not keeping the Torah.
Yeah, let's keep going. Right. I think it's worth doing this because people get thrown these quotes the whole time. So it's worth going through them.
Okay, so Tosfos Yevamos 84b. Now, I've checked this Tosfos because I wasn't familiar with it. Tosfos is not the Talmud, it's a commentary on the Talmud. There's 3 on that page. I checked them. I don't believe it's there. I think this is a fabrication. Again, I might be wrong. If somebody can, or maybe it's it's a very surprising phrase. And if it exists anywhere, which I don't believe it does, then what you'll have is, I'm sure, like all the others, it'll just be completely out of context nonsense. Next one, if a Jew finds an object lost by a Gentile, it does not have to be returned. Well, that's because under Gentile law, it does not have to be returned. The Talmudic principle, by the way, if there is a Gentile law that says you do have to return it, which a lot of states have nowadays, then a Jewish citizen of that country or a Jewish visitor to that country is absolutely bound by their law. The Torah has 2 principles. What's the absolute base legal obligation, basic moral obligation? And the general principle in the ancient world was finders keepers. I believe it's even in Roman law that way. So if you find a lost item, you're legally allowed to keep it. The Torah then says you're meant to go beyond the law when it comes, you're meant to treat Jewish people like you treat your own family members. So that to the non-Jews of the world, we're like friends, right? To the Jewish people of the world, we're like family. And the Torah always demands that you go beyond what's the general normal obligation. So even in a place where there's no legal obligation to return and finders keepers, right? If they're Jewish, you have an obligation to return. If they're not Jewish, you have an obligation to do whatever is the normal law of the land. That's all. So it's like, you look at this, you see, we don't like non-Jews. God forbid, right? And like I say, in any legal place or where the norm and the standard behaviors assume that you return it, you return it. Jews may use lies to circumvent a Goy Gentile, Bava Kama 113a. Now this, I'm afraid, ironically enough, is a lie. That's not what the Talmud says. In fact, the Talmud is very explicit that we're not allowed to lie against a non-Jew. Bava Kama 113a, Jews may use lies to circumvent a Goy Gentile. That is rubbish. I'll just give you a classical Talmudic source. Chulin 94a, Shmuel says it's forbidden to deceive anyone, even an idolatrous Gentile. Right? I'm not talking about non-Jews, I'm talking about people who are absolute idol worshippers, never allowed to. And again, numerous other sources say the same thing. What's going on in 113a is a different principle. Is if you're doing business with somebody who's not Jewish and they make a mistake and give you more than they make a mistake in your favor, you're not obligated to return the mistake. That's all. Again, that was a standard practice in legal system. If the local law of the land is different, you're always obligated to follow the standard of the law of the land. But it never says you can use lies to circumvent a non-Jew. On the contrary, it will be absolutely forbidden to lie, to steal, to cheat them in any possible way. And that's explicit only in the Talmud, that's explicit in all the codes of Jewish law too. So it's typical, so this is an example of something that whoever wrote this clearly knew they were distorting. There were others where it could have been a genuine mistake. There's no way that was a genuine mistake. That was an absolute distortion, like the majority of them. Last one, Avodah Zarah 22a, 22b, Gentile goys prefer sex with cows. Rubbish. What's going on over there is there's a law in a place which was quite frequent at the time of when Jewish law was being codified, where some of the pagan idolatrous people around would also engage in bestiality. If you suspect that's what's going on, you're forbidden to sell an animal where it's reasonable to assume that it might be used for sex with an animal, right? In other words, you have to protect them from sinning, you have to protect the animal from abuse. You can't just do that. That's all that's going on over there. In any scenario where you know that's not what's going on, then you're not bound by the same prohibition. So this is, by the way, also you should know another thing which is very important. Many of the commentaries on the Talmud, most famously the medieval Meiri, wrote that from that Talmud you see that some of these lines even are based on what was going on in their time, when it was very typical for certain non-Jewish groups in the area of the Talmud in Babylonia, let's say, where there would be certain very immoral behavior and lots of abuse of Jews. That's always what it means in the Talmud whenever it first. Now, we've already seen, if I had to sum up everything we've seen, these are basically misquotes, fabrications, misinterpretations, right? Going back, you should know, I quoted at the beginning, I said that a lot of these go all the way back to Eisenmenger in the 1600s. They were recycled in the 1880s. After the German Academy of Sciences had explicitly pointed out, had done the research that I've shown you right now, and said these are basically all misquotes, fabrications, or completely one-sided misinterpretations. Another guy came up in Prague who was a professor called August Rohling. In 1880s, he wrote the Talmud Jew, right, which was the Talmudic Jew. And again, using many of these, he actually added, some of these are from him, some of these, mostly it's from Eisenmenger already, and he added a few other fabrications in as well. And there was a rabbi at the time called Rabbi Joseph Bloch, who publicly challenged him and offered him 3,000 thaler, was the currency at the time, if he could even read a page of Talmud. Right? Meaning, and actually Rohling sued him for libel. It's a whole case, you can read about it online. Basically, the Vienna court wanted to appoint a panel of experts, and Rohling argued that Jewish expert would be biased. They have to be Christians, and not any old Christians, but pure-blooded Christians. And the court agreed. So it found these non-Jewish professors who spent 2 years researching all of these quotes, like really thoroughly, these and many, many others. And they prepared a whole report for the court. And it was very obvious that Rohling was going to lose the case. So he withdrew his case, he got fired from his academic position, right? And he was completely disgraced. He had to pay the cost of the court, etc. Right? Now, the problem is these survived. They were resurrected in Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda pre-war. Today, they just they circulate all over the internet. Whenever you've got groups that hate Jews or hate Israel or hate both, these are like these very dominant ones. I think if you really want to understand the Talmudic position on non-Jews, it's things we've already said, right? And I'll quote another source. Perkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers, chapter 5. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. Adam is beloved. And there again, a classical example where the word Adam is clearly being used to mean Jews and non-Jews, all of humanity. Because later on also talks about the brotherly love you meant to have with the Jewish people as Jews to Jews. But this is Chaviv Adam, you're meant to see that everyone in the world, every human being is beloved to God, shenivra b'tzelem, because each one of them, black and white, tall or short, male and female, whoever they are on planet Earth, is created in the image of God. You know, I said in a previous video, we Jewish people don't begin our calendar at the beginning of the Jewish religion, right? Talmudic principle. You don't begin. Every religion begins its calendar at the key moment at the start of its religion, right? So Christianity, it'll be, the year 2024 since Jesus came along and the beginning of Christian religion. the Muslim calendar 1446, since the Prophet Muhammad gave his teachings, right? Judaism doesn't do it since Moshe, the Prophet, gave the Torah, or even since Abraham. We go all the way back to Adam, that word again, because Adam is humanity. And that means the Jewish religion is not about the Jewish people. It's about the whole of mankind. Yes, we believe we have a responsibility to the world. We took on a responsibility that entails a difficult history, that entails a standard that we often fall very short of and get punished for, right? It entails a responsibility that we don't proselytize others to join us in, but if others want to join, we have so much love and respect for them. But if they want to stay in the non-Jewish world, just being good human beings and making the world a better place as a result, chaviv, they are beloved to God and beloved to us.
Yeah. And the other irony, of course, is that there's clearly verses in, let's say, the other main monotheistic faiths where Jewish people have, from some people in those communities, have felt the most severe kind of forms of anti-Semitism, where you genuinely do have verses that are hostile, that are exclusive, that are just racist towards Jewish people, that are far more tricky to look at in some kind of positive light. And I know, of course, people do those things, those communities. They find ways to address them, and absolutely accept that. But it just is. It seems to me almost ridiculous that we're having to go through this exercise of trying to deconstruct a characterization of Judaism which is just so alien to the Judaism I've ever really known or experienced, and I'm sure the same for you as well.
Right. Now, when you talk about other religions, I'm always very careful because I'm not an expert on them. I may have seen quotes or whatever, and I think we have to always let people, give people benefit of the doubt, and let people explain what the sources mean in context. I think Talmud is a particularly complex source. Right now I'm doing a PhD in the philosophy of mathematics. You can enter a discipline, take a doctorate in it, do a postdoc, and let's say probably within about less than 10 years, become, if you're reasonably intelligent and work hard enough, you might become one of the world's experts at it. You can't become a world expert at Talmud in 10 years. It's way too dense, way too difficult. It's really, really hard working through Talmud, right? It is, right? These are recordings, like I said, these are oral recordings of centuries of discussions at very high analytic levels, where lots of homiletics are being done, where lots of people are being quoted, throwing things in and out of the discussion. If you want just an isolated line in the Talmud, say anything you want, you probably can find it. Yeah. You've got to look at all these sources inside. I think it's very consistent. Yes, there's divergence of opinion in the Talmud. For example, how do we relate to the Roman oppression? Do we admire all the good they've done? Do we look down at all the oppression they've done? You get all these debates going on. But the general attitude towards non-Jews, towards human beings, towards creations of God, despite any suffering the rabbis of Talmud have been through, and some non-Jews, is, of course, at this point, which I keep emphasizing, the righteous have the place in the world to come. We have a love for all of God's creations and all of God's humanity, right? And so on and so forth. It's very thematic. So you're right. Sometimes when you live inside a system, it's much easier to appreciate its worldview than if you're just looking outside and getting quotes, especially when quotes are circulated so often, because they're, oh, this one says it, 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 right? It's, but look, hopefully, I'm sure there's people watching this who are just like, oh, these guys are just lying and hiding. Hopefully people are open-minded will either check them out themselves, or have seen enough here that they understand what's really going on with all of these, and will understand that. And again, I'm happy for people to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to provide more sources on any of this. There is actually a very good website, which I'd recommend, called The Real Truth About the Talmud by Rabbi Gil Student. He put up years ago when this stuff was much more around internet than social media. And he goes through some of these sources as well and explains some of the principles. But look, I just hope that we can get to a point where people feel that they do not need to demonize Jews or demonize any other human beings. Whatever the psychological need or sociological need that's been there for centuries to demonize the Jewish people, this is a very, very unfortunate part of our history, and an unfortunate part of some of the less healthy parts of humanity. And I think what we, as a general rule, forget the Jewish people. If we're going to live together on this planet and share it, if we believe in one God who created everybody, we have to learn to look in each other and see the good. I have to learn to say to somebody, 1 second, I want to be your friend. I want to hear your perspective, even if I don't agree with it. And here I've heard somebody quote some sources. How do you interpret those? Do you understand it that way? Do you not understand it that way? Right? And that's even when it's not Talmud, even when it's something much easier than a Talmudic text.
Yeah. Rabbi, just before we finish, I think that's a great point to finish on, but is there any sense in which the Jewish legal philosophical framework and approach towards the non-Jewish world has shifted, given that 2,000 years ago, when you'd think about Jews and their relationship with non-Jews, the world was a lot more barbaric. War was far more common. Idol worship and immorality was far more common. The world has come a long, long way. And so thanks very much in part to the Jewish people and their voice. But I'm wondering, is there any legitimacy to this notion of saying there might actually be some if someone were to say, I can see there are hostile elements in the Talmud, but they wouldn't apply so much today because we've had such changes in the way the world functions, the world's morality? Or is that also not even true?
Well, the example would be, do you return a lost item, for example, right? So again, nowadays irrelevant because almost every legal system will say you do. Right? Okay. But I suppose we're in a world where there's no legal systems. So they could ask, there is a discussion whether that was specifically against a certain type of barbaric society, which was very lawless. So again, like I said, in the era already in medieval times wrote that humanity has transcended that, and therefore it could even be, if there wasn't irrelevant of the local legal system, that we, just like we're supposed to treat Jews beyond the law, you would treat moral non-Jews beyond the law too, right? Meaning you would treat them like you treat family rather than just how you treat a legal system. So there is such an attitude as well, that again, righteous among the non-Jews, who may be the vast majority of mankind by now, by that definition. There are those who say that they become, to some degree, the way we treat Jews. Okay, that's a technical point. But broadly speaking, the Talmud always saw, even while it was being oppressed, and even while a lot of the cultures around us were much less law-like and were, certainly from the Jewish perspective, places where oppression against the Jew happened, we still have to see always into the image of God and see the beloved aspect of all of them, right? There's, like I said over there, you're not allowed to lie, you're not allowed to steal, you're not allowed to cheat, you've got to promote the well-being. The Talmud says elsewhere you're meant to greet everybody with a warm glow, walking down the street. Everywhere you're meant to go, you're meant to make sure you're a blessing to the world around you. Okay, so these are the fundamental principles of Talmud. Like I say, half of those were, almost all of them were either complete misquotes. One or two of them were complete out of nowhere misquotes. Others were attempts to summarize Talmudic discussion, radically misunderstanding it, right? Thinking that we say non-Jews are not human. God forbid, there was nowhere, as I showed you, nowhere where it said such a thing, right?
Yep.
There was, on the contrary, the Talmud is very, very clear about how we do look. But yes, do we also admire the advances that have been made in the moral standards of the non-Jewish world over the last few thousand years? Absolutely. The move towards monotheism has become a lot stronger. There's no more infanticide being done in the non-Jewish world, which it was done in pagan societies. There's no more withholding education from children, which until relatively only a few centuries ago was still the norm. Every society today, right? Once upon a time, it was only ancient Israel that held to this, and the prophets of ancient Israel. But today, every society agrees that you've got to care for the weakest members of society. Today, every society agrees that we want the day when the whole world's at peace, right? These were not things that were there in the ancient world. So we can certainly admire the advance and changes. Whether or not that changes our attitude depends on how much more we already love people, we already see them as beloved, we already see. But there are those who say that on technical grounds, they may have moved much more into the orbit of family than just friends or acquaintances or whatever it would have been. That's maybe a debatable ground.
Brilliant. Rabbi, thank you so much for your time, for going through this with us. I really think that this is such an essential thing that people come to know, because unfortunately, these kind of nonsense conspiracy theory talk is I'm seeing becoming a little bit more prominent among some social media figures and personalities, and therefore so important that we do this and get the facts out. So thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.